B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, October 28th, 2020. I want to make sure every listener knows that your humble host has plans to gracefully or somehow, some other way, head into retirement. And sometime in November or December, I'm going to end the Daily News and Comment podcast. I'm pegging it to the resolution of the presidential election, which is an elusive moving target at this particular point. So today it was another ritual grilling of tech CEOs on Capitol Hill, and the boys from Silicon Valley didn't even have to leave their lairs, even take off their yoga pants, because they zoomed in to a socially distanced hearing held by the Senate committee, Judiciary. And unfortunately, none of these showdowns ever result in anything meaningful. Oh, they go through the motions of tightening up standards and fighting foreign interference, and, they make all kinds of broad statements about supporting free speech. But it's mostly an opportunity for lawmakers, in this case senators, to unload, to posture. And often they just hammer these guys and don't even actually ask them any serious questions. So you got your Twitter CEO, Jack Dorsey, your Facebook CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, and Sundar Pichai, who runs Google and Alphabet. And nominally, the hearing was to discuss Section 230 of the Internet Decency Law, which allows them to avoid responsibility for anything that is published on their platforms. The users are responsible, and not the companies that avoid calling themselves publishers. And Trump has been gunning to either repeal or modify Section 230. And it was barely discussed because the Republicans wanted to hammer the CEOs, primarily Dorsey of Twitter, about censoring the president and other conservative content. They believe that Silicon Valley is deeply biased against them. As we established yesterday and in many other of my news and comment podcasts, the opposite is true. The Republicans and the conservatives and much of their hateful speech is allowed a free ride. When we've seen that the throttling, particularly at Facebook, is aimed at left-leaning, or at least left identity, independent media outlets. So Republican after Republican accused Twitter of mishandling Trump's tweets. Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee claimed the company had censored Trump 65 times and Biden 0 times. Jack Dorsey, in what's described as a pretty mild-mannered response, to be clear, we have not censored the president. We have not taken the tweets down that you're referencing. We added additional context, as we do with any world leader. And so it's really frustrating because nobody actually demands that Facebook and Twitter live up to the community standards that they arbitrarily enforce on people who don't have the status of a guy like Trump. And this is just so frustrating because we'll see this ritual repeated with the new Congress in the spring. And I predict that very little will change. And fundamentally, I believe that more and more these companies are taking on the role of publisher, which they seek to avoid and wriggle out of, while claiming that they're not censoring or throttling or manipulating information. And if you've seen The Social Dilemma, which does go to an extreme in fear-mongering, I'd say, but it is valuable in pointing out how the artificial intelligence that drives Facebook and Twitter leads you into confirmation bias rabbit holes that can often persuade you to move more in a direction that is dictated by these social media platforms. So, as always, the CEOs indicate that they're open to reform. But Zuckerberg warned that tech companies were likely to censor more content to avoid legal risks if Section 230 were repealed. And curiously, that is not really in Trump's self-interest. But, of course, he bobs and weaves all over the place, and, rational and coherent thinking is not a part of the stable genius's talent bank, his personal talent bank. And Twitter's Dorsey argued that eroding the foundation of Section 230 could collapse how we communicate on the Internet, leaving only a small number of giant and well-funded technology companies. Yeah, like yours. And it is believed that Facebook has been inviting regulation in a form that it could help shape that would prevent competitors from arising in the space because enforcement of those rules would be too costly for a startup. So Shelley Moore Capito, Republican senator from West Virginia, she asked the CEOs about a clause in Section 230 that protects companies from liability for restricting access to content that they deem, quote, obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable. And she asked whether they would be in favor of redefining the phrase, quote, otherwise objectionable. So Zuck said, I would worry that some of the proposals that suggest getting rid of the phrase otherwise objectionable from Section 230 would limit our ability to remove bullying and harassing content from our platforms. I think we need to be careful in how we think through that. Amy Klobuchar, the Democrat from Minnesota, attacked Google over its reaction to the recent antitrust lawsuit that came from Bill Barr's Justice Department and Trump Law Shop. She said that Google's response was insulting. And in a bipartisan moment, or was it a nanosecond, Ted Cruz said Google has more power than any company on the face of the planet. But despite his harangue, he didn't actually ask Pichai a question. And Cruz is a skilled lawyer who might have some actual ideas. But no, he was content to shout at Dorsey. He questioned Dorsey about Twitter's decision to block the New York Post article about Hunter Biden's laptop and all that stuff. And Dorsey did acknowledge that it was a mistake and that it had been corrected, at least on Twitter. He went on to say that Twitter could not influence the vote because Americans have a variety of social media channels to communicate. He said the decision to block links to that Post article, that decision was incorrect and it had been changed. And Cruz amped it up. Dorsey, who the hell elected you and put you in charge of what the media are allowed to report and what the American people are allowed to hear? And knowing that there's no need to engage, Dorsey blandly responded, we realize we need to earn trust more. Oh, yeah. And Maria Cantwell, Democrat from Washington State, told the CEOs, I hope today we'll get a report from the witnesses on exactly what they've been doing to clamp down on election interference. I hope that they will tell us what kind of hate speech and misinformation they have taken off the books. So that's a clear call for censorship. And so this mixed signal, here they are discussing 230. And the central issue there, as I've bored you with repeatedly, is whether or not these platforms are publishers or whether they're more like common carriers. It's just a utility, and the public gets to use it as the public wishes. But clearly, Democrats, who are supposed to be liberal, right? They seem to be most intent on empowering censorship while not explicitly calling for these companies to be legally tagged as publishers. And the publisher issue comes up here. I've got an article. I want to thank Carl Howard for tipping me off to the World Socialist website under the byline of Kevin Reed, where he reports that Facebook is preparing an aggressive program of censorship for the presidential election next week. According to the Wall Street Journal, teams of Facebook employees have been formed to deploy specially developed software tools previously used to calm election-related conflict in at-risk countries. Well, you'll be happy to know that these methods have been test-driven in Sri Lanka and Myanmar and are part of a larger toolkit developed by Facebook to prepare for the American election. Among the features are across-the-board slowing of the spread of posts if they start to go viral, the ability to tweak the news feed to change what types of content users see. Yeah, give me more brunch and kitty cats, will you? And lowering the threshold for detecting types of content that its software views as dangerous. So they're going to be throttling everything back into the blue sky, happy talk, everybody's nice zone. And I do think there are legitimate concerns about angry exchanges that could lead to violent actions in the streets of America. But is censorship on Facebook what is needed here? And will it have any impact? So the Wall Street Journal sources said that Facebook needs to be prepared for all possibilities and use the tools to alter what tens of millions of Americans see when they log onto the platform, diminishing their exposure to sensationalism, incitements to violence, and misinformation. But, of course, who gets to decide what is misinformation? And that's where Facebook has recruited a very checkered crew of people whose political interests are easy to identify, and they're not about free speech. They're about trying to silence certain types of expression that are not considered part of the orthodox mainstream. Zuckerberg went on to say at one of his company-wide meetings last week that was recorded, once we're past these events and we've resolved them peacefully, I wouldn't expect that we continue to adopt a lot more policies that are restricting of a lot more content. There are enough double negatives in there that I don't know what the hell that means. Also, in his company-wide talk, he said, we've had ongoing work in a number of countries that we consider at risk, like Myanmar, Sri Lanka, or Ethiopia, where the determination that we've made alongside human rights groups and local groups on the ground is that a wider band of speech and expression would lead potentially to more incitement of violence or different issues. What exactly is a wider band of speech? And who decides just how wide that aperture should be? And what are the standards? Are they applied in a very consistent manner? Or an arbitrary way just based on whatever pops up in the massive stream of communications that go through Facebook every minute? So, in many ways, social media are not on the ballot this year, but they are being reviewed. I think many users are growing tired and suspicious They know that the news feed is manipulated to show them certain ads, but they don't know what's behind the selection of which friends' posts we get to see and which ones are just not so important from Facebook's point of view. And for me, Twitter is an even deeper mess, where the whole purpose is just to piss on each other and claim that my idea is better than your idea. Neener, neener, neener. So now that we've been mean to the tech giants, let's take their side for a moment. Because one of the things that Facebook has done in the past few months is put up portals on its site that have registered an estimated 4.4 million people to vote this November who were not, until that point, registered. And this has drawn the objections and the ire of 6 Republican secretaries of state. They don't want Facebook registering voters. And these are the election officials in Alabama, Idaho, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and West Virginia. They argued that it's their job to register voters, and Facebook has no responsibility or such accountability. Then they make up reasons why this is not a good idea. And I would substitute for their bullshit. The number one, they're trying to block people who are likely Democrats or first-time voters from participating. And that when they get these registrations from third-party sources, they can't control them. They can't trash them or reject them. And probably they complain it creates more work for them, too. I recommend an op-ed published in today's New York Times under the bylines of Akhil Reed Amar, Vikram David Amar, and Neil Kumar Katyal. You're probably most familiar with Neil Katyal. He was an acting Solicitor General, and he comments on a lot of issues. He teaches at Georgetown. And Akhil Amar is a professor at the Yale Law School. Vikram Amar, I believe, used to be either at UC Hastings or at UC Berkeley. He's now the dean of the University of Illinois College of Law. And this trio makes the argument that the U.S. Supreme Court should stay out of state election law. I've been talking about this a lot since Friday when we posted the latest in-depth interview with Greg Palast, where in part we addressed the interference by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it continued into this week, blocking Wisconsin from softening the deadline, not for when your vote had to be mailed, but when it had to be received at the election office. And this kind of micromanagement, most often conducted by the conservative majority with no explanation. Sometimes we get a hint of the explanation when dissents are posted by the 3 remaining liberal-leaning justices. And so this op-ed writes that one of the things that's going on here, particularly in Wisconsin, and also in Pennsylvania, is that the Supreme Court is micromanaging state election laws, which really are the purview of a state Supreme Court, even in states where those courts are packed with Republicans and where those justices are directly elected by big money interests. And I agree with these 3 law professors. They note that this past Monday night, Brett Kavanaugh referred to the Bush v. Gore 2000. Now, there are a number of issues related to this. Number one, Kavanaugh wasn't on the court at the time, and Kavanaugh was not one of the 3 current members of the court who went to Florida to jam up the vote count so the Supreme Court could decide it in favor of George W. Bush. Those would be Justice Roberts, Justice Gorsuch, and the newest one, Justice Barrett. But Kavanaugh invoked the Bush v. Gore ruling, claiming that the Supreme Court should feel free to second-guess state court interpretations of state election law whenever presidential elections are at issue. And I'm not a legal scholar or trained in the law, but I believe from my own reading back at the time that Bush v. Gore was decided in a way that was explicitly non-precedential. No precedent could be set. And so to hear Justice Kavanaugh treated as a precedent is troubling. And it indicates to me that electoral shenanigans through interference by SCOTUS are almost predictable as soon as the Republicans can find a basis to draw the court's involvement. And these three law professors say that, in fact, this part of Bush v. Gore has already squarely been rejected by a landmark case in 2015, the Arizona Legislature versus the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. And it was RBG who had emphatically dissented in Bush v. Gore, who said nothing in the federal Constitution instructs, nor has this court ever held, that a state legislature may regulate federal elections in defiance of the provisions of the state's Constitution. And so, for example, when election officials under state law decide to extend a deadline for mail-in ballots, considering the effort to dismantle the post office and the threat of the pandemic, they're way out of line. And here's the money quote from this op-ed: allowing federal courts to muck around with state election laws is dangerous and destabilizing. States generally set uniform rules for federal and state elections. Giving federal courts latitude to topple state rules, but only for federal elections, eviscerates in-state uniformity. Does it really make sense that your ballot in Pennsylvania will count for state elections, but not the presidency, or federal House or Senate races for that matter, if it arrives on November 5th? And they close with this: the federal Constitution is emphatically clear, and so is federal precedent. Any potential Supreme Court ruling to the contrary, especially any ruling with a partisan alignment, would be a disaster for the court and the country. One Bush v. Gore is enough. So we know that Republican election meddling, suppression tactics, voter roll purges, these are all aimed at keeping Democrats from voting, right? Well, yesterday, Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, he went to his polling place, and he announced that he would like a ballot. They said, "Well, Governor, what's your address?" He gave them his address. But the poll worker advised him that in the official records, his address had been changed to a location on Pretty Lane in West Palm Beach. I didn't take the time to check and see if that's a real street or if this is a real address. But DeSantis said he did not authorize a change in his address. So authorities discovered that the address change had been made online. They found the computer's IP address. They contacted Comcast, which gave them the home address to which the IP address was assigned. And now Anthony Guevara has been placed under arrest for hacking in the voter files in Florida and changing the home address of its governor. And as we look at all of the efforts to keep people from voting, all of these rules, the limited polling places, limited early voting, restrictions on where you can deliver your mail-in ballot, and so many other ways they're trying to keep people from voting, this is what makes me extremely nervous. We are 6 days away from the election, and the biggest lead that Biden enjoys in a major battleground state is the 10-point lead in Wisconsin. Michigan, it's 8 points. Pennsylvania, 6. Arizona, 4. Florida and North Carolina, 2. And these are based on state-level polls that have a higher margin of error. And so when you get below the 6-point lead in Pennsylvania, those numbers are inside the margin of error, and they are essentially a tie. And so it is a little scary at this point out that the media organizations who are declaring that Trump is likely to lose, they have all these scenarios where Biden scores well in the Electoral College and Trump does not. But these polls do not account for the election interference, for the meddling conducted by Americans on American elections. And then there are other complications. A court in Michigan has overruled the Secretary of State and permitted people to open carry their weapons to their polling place. Now, I thought the Secretary of State's decision to not permit that is extremely sensible, especially after the Wolverine mobs showed up at the state capitol in Lansing with their long guns and semi-automatic weapons. And this will lead to voter intimidation, even if those guns, the pistols, remain holstered and the long guns remain uncocked. But this is the kind of move through partisan-controlled courts that leave us reeling, that leave us feeling we're living in a country that we don't know, that the right wing has taken such firm control, and they're imposing irrational idiocy on what we like to think of as a civilized society. And Trump's been barnstorming all over the country. He had a mob rally in Lansing. It was yesterday. And what did he do? He renewed his attacks on Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And he claims he only criticizes her because she's such a lousy governor. And he made a flat denial on 60 Minutes the other night. I finally watched that interview last night. He flatly said that he has not, quote, gone after Gretchen Whitmer. And that's just a complete lie. Anybody who examines his tweets, his comments about that woman in Michigan, his more recent mob rally calls to lock her up, and he did it again last night. He allows the crowd to get into a chant of lock her up. Then he says lock them all up. And when he's questioned by reporters who he considers hostile, he just denies it. So here's his quote from Lansing last night. Hey, I'm the one. It was our people who helped her out with her problem. That was the attempt to kidnap, try her, and execute her. It's just a little problem, right? Then he said, he equivocated, we'll have to see if it's a problem. People are entitled to say, maybe it was a problem, maybe it wasn't. It was our people, my people, our people who helped her out. And then she blamed me for it. Well, I mean, this is insanely disingenuous. But his mobs lap it up because they believe the bullshit that he pumps out. And there is no standard for what is truth. And he just blusters on. And when he can't have his way with, say, Leslie Stahl, he just storms out because he's a victim of the liberal media that's out to get him. So he creates these dynamics, then detaches himself from them and says, what are you talking about? The Washington Post today, building on the case of Gretchen Whitmer, talks about the impact on others who've been threatened by Trump, like the whistleblower who's still officially unnamed, who led to the Ukraine investigation that then led to the impeachment of the president. He was not removed, but he remains impeached. And that unnamed analyst spent months living in a no-frills hotel under surveillance by CIA security. He was driven to work by armed officers in an unmarked car. On the few occasions he was allowed to re-enter his own home to retrieve belongings, a security team had to sweep the place before he was allowed to enter. And the conclusion here is that violent messages surged each time the analyst was targeted in tweets or public remarks by the president. And, noting with alarm, the voice of the Post says the dynamic appears to be without precedent. Government agencies taking extraordinary measures to protect their people from strains of seething hostility stoked by a sitting president. Then they go into the Whitmer case, and then in, journalistic style, they introduce a comment from a White House spokeswoman. And you know what? First she says, Trump has never advocated for violence against those he disagrees with, unlike Democrats. And then they trot out Maxine Waters, who I can say, we're not personal friends, but I have affection for her, and I've talked with her on many occasions. She sometimes does muck things up. But in 2018, Maxine urged supporters to respond to the administration's policy of separating migrant children from their families at the border by confronting Trump officials in public. You push back on them, Waters said, and tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere. Now, this is so lame, and it is not nearly equivalent. She's talking about people in public places. She's not suggesting that they carry weapons or threaten people. She's saying that that people should speak up and share their outrage about an immoral policy. So that's the world that the Trumpers live in. When you criticize Trump for his unfair and emotional attacks on his considered opponents, then he comes up with a ridiculous counter. And his bobblehead fans just nod, oh yeah, Maxine Waters. Well, of course, she's black. That's what they're really nodding about. That's the real basis for trivializing her comment and amping it up to the equivalent of the threats on the life of Governor Whitmer. And I'm no fan of Adam Schiff, chair of the Intelligence Committee in the House. He's a Burbank Democrat from here in California. And he was also one of the lawyers who argued for his removal in the Senate trial. And Schiff said in a statement to the Post, when Trump suggests darkly that something should happen to his political opponents, as he did to me last week at a rally, or calls someone a traitor, or urges that they be locked up, it goes beyond political rhetoric and borders on incitement. The truth is, Trump knows exactly what he's doing with these statements, and that some of his supporters will take him seriously and literally. We must not ignore the danger he is creating. Now, with this said, I have to take exception to yellow journalism that I saw online last night. And I believe it was the Michigan rally. They're all blurring together now. He's doing 2 or 3 a day. But Trump made the comment that the Democrats have set the stage for using the 25th Amendment. And he believes it's not aimed at removing him from the presidency, but a way to remove Joe Biden. And he has repeatedly and recently used a phrase. I heard it when he was on with Rush Limbaugh a few weeks ago. And Trump says things to the effect that Joe Biden is over the hill, that he's addled, that he is suffering from mental defects. And the phrase he uses is that Joe is shot. So at the rally, he used shorthand And he said, Democrats, 25th Amendment, 3 weeks in, Joe's shot, and Kamala takes over. So that was interpreted by Crooks and Liars and other posts on my Facebook feed last night that he was suggesting that Biden had been shot, that he had been the subject of an attempted assassination. And I listened to the clip very carefully. There's absolutely nothing to indicate that Trump was suggesting the assassination scenario. And so it really pained me to see leftists using yellow journalism like that to pounce on Trump's remark, take it out of context, twist it, and then say that somehow he's advocating the assassination of Joe Biden. And he may well do that at some point, but it didn't occur at that particular event and in the video clip that I reviewed. So Trump's last stop last night was at an airfield in Nebraska, where his cult followers showed up. This was near Omaha at Eppley Airfield, and the president left on Air Force One just after 9 p.m. But many of his supporters were stuck there until almost midnight, miles away from their cars, waiting for buses the Trump campaign had chartered to shuttle them back to the parking lot. 30 people were contacted for medical reasons, and 7 were taken to the hospital. There were at least a couple of cases identified as hypothermia for people who were out there in the frozen nighttime weather in Nebraska. All this in search of the single electoral college vote that Nebraska represents. That's desperation, wouldn't you say? I mean, Trump went to Erie, Pennsylvania last weekend, and he told them, he said, if this election weren't so close, I never would be here. And then, of course, he blamed COVID. And that's just another coded attack on the media for focusing on the pandemic that has risked a lot of lives in this country, taken as many as 220,000 plus the excess deaths that are indirectly caused by the pandemic. And he does try to create his own alternate reality. He says we've turned the corner. A White House press release said that Trump has ended the COVID-19 pandemic. And he repeatedly says, and this has been a talking point since March, that after November 4th, the media coverage is just going to shift to other topics, that they are simply exploiting COVID to make him look bad and to cause him to lose. And you got to ignore so much to believe that BS. You have to ignore the escalating rate of cases, how in many states hospitals are reaching capacity, ICUs are transferring people to other states because they're maxed out. Barack Obama appears to be having some fun at Trump's expense as he hits the campaign trail to support Biden. As I've commented, I don't know why he waited so long. 70 million people have already voted, and he's out there trying to persuade. I think the timing is off. But he had some pretty good lines. He said, what is Trump's closing argument? That people are too focused on COVID? He said at one of his rallies, COVID. He's complaining. He is jealous of COVID's media coverage, Obama said, with mock incredulity. In North Carolina, Trump actually said those words. Obama's retort, if he'd been focused on COVID from the beginning, cases would not be reaching record highs across the country this week. The White House would not be having its second outbreak in a month. And Obama also skewered the White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, for his remark on television Sunday that the administration is not going to control the pandemic. Obama's response, winter is coming. They're waving the white flag of surrender. Florida, we can't afford 4 more years of this. That's why we've got to send Joe Biden to the White House. Oh, and this really cracked me up. And let's credit the columnist, one of the columnists at the Seattle Times, Danny Westneat, because he brought to my attention that over the weekend, the newspaper in nearby Spokane, which is called the Spokesman Review, published its editorial endorsing Donald Trump for a second term. And this is the most unusual endorsement you'll ever hear about. The opening line, Donald Trump is a bully and a bigot. Yes, it went on, it's true, Trump panders to racists. He endlessly tweets conspiracy theories. He denies climate change. And he's been cavalier about COVID-19 and has led poorly through the pandemic. In addition, he is a wretched human being, the editorial concluded, adding, we recommend voting for him anyway. Well, this unsigned endorsement was the sole opinion of the publisher of this paper. His name is Stacy Cowles, and his journalism team is really pissed at him because of the attacks Trump has made on the media and because the impression is that everybody at the newspaper supports this highly unusual endorsement. As you may know, I sit about a half mile from the notorious San Quentin State Prison here in California, where there have been 2,200 cases of COVID. 28 men have died, and recently a court of appeals here in California ordered the prison population reduced by half, either by letting guys out or transferring them to other prisons. So, according to The Guardian, which is involved in a project at San Quentin, they conducted a mock election among the inmates who are not permitted to vote under California law. And the Solitary Watch program, which is supported by The Guardian, they printed up ballots, they mailed them to the inmates, but the ballots have been sitting in the prison mailroom for weeks and for whatever reason have not been delivered. So they just made up paper ballots, hand-marked paper ballots. And you won't be too surprised, but the vote tally so far of San Quentin prisoners is 8-1 in favor of Joe Biden. In Philadelphia, protest continued last night as we learned more about the police shooting of 27-year-old Walter Wallace, who his family explained had a bipolar disorder. And we've learned that on Monday, when the police came and shot Walter Wallace with 10 bullets because they said he had a knife, and I've seen the video, he was at least 10 feet away from the cops and could not have harmed them unless he was really good at throwing a knife. And they pumped him with 10 bullets. And we learned from Walter Wallace's family that the shooting spree occurred on the third visit of the day by the police. And on that third incident, the family had called for an ambulance to take their mentally ill son to a hospital. The younger Wallace was described by relatives as suffering from a mental breakdown, but a call for help where they requested an ambulance, not police, ended in a deadly confrontation. And get this, Walter Wallace's mother, Catherine, is the one who disclosed that the police had been to the family's house 2 times before this final incident. She said one of those times they stood there and laughed at us. Now, this shows that rank-and-file police officers have not learned a damn thing from the summer of rage, the outrage over George Floyd, the calls for police to be at least accompanied, if not supplanted, by social workers or mental health workers in a case like this one? And we've still got to ask, why do you fire 10 bullets and kill a guy when he posed no imminent threat to the officers? Now, I do deplore the vandalism and the looting that has occurred in Philadelphia, including in the minority neighborhood of Port Richmond. And it kills me when I see these scenes on television of the looting of a dollar store. Now, if you're going to loot, even in an act of protest, can't you at least go for something valuable? And if you're going to risk a term in state prison, because all of this is now captured on video, you're not going to get away with it. Hey, wouldn't you want to go for something that really has some value? I know I'm projecting rational thinking where it doesn't exist. More than 100 racial justice protesters gathered last night in downtown Portland, and it was a peaceful event. There were no arrests. There was an expression of solidarity. And the interesting little connection between Philly and Portland is that the current police commissioner in Philadelphia, who has said that she will get to the bottom of it, she's an African-American woman named, curiously, Danielle Outlaw. Well, Danielle Outlaw was formerly the police chief in Portland. And I think it's interesting to see that when cops, particularly the top brass, when they are failures, they get bounced from one department and they just move across the country and get hired somewhere else. At Shadowproof today, Kevin Gosztola has a great report detailing the life and times of the man who blew the whistle on Scott Pruitt. He was the high-flying, big-spending head of the EPA during the first 2 years of the Trump term. And it was one of his staffers, a political appointee who was the deputy chief of staff at the EPA, Kevin, and this is hard, there's a vowel missing, Chmielewski. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Anyway, Chmielewski faced a retaliatory investigation from the Office of Inspector General that falsely accused him of not having a security clearance and covering up a past arrest. So he's fighting back. He claims that Corey Lewandowski, who was once Trump's campaign manager, he told the whistleblower that Pruitt knew about Chmielewski's disclosures. So Pruitt demoted him before Pruitt himself resigned in disgrace from the EPA. He was pressured to, Chmielewski was pressured to resign by a White House liaison to the EPA. And then Pruitt himself resigned a few months later. That was in July of 2018. And if you remember, Pruitt was chartering private jets. He was spending worse than a drunken sailor. He spent more than $120,000 during a June 2017 trip to Italy. It was organized under the guise of meeting with environmental ministers from G7 countries. It included a $30,000 security detail, $90,000 spent on food, hotels, commercial airfare, and an $11,000 military jet used by the administrator and his 9 staffers. And that was just to fly from Cincinnati to New York to connect to the international flights. I mean, that's a pretty expensive charter deal. So on October 21st, that was just the other day, Trump issued his executive order to reclassify a number of federal government positions. And as it would apply here going forward, a guy like Chmielewski would be much easier to fire because no cause would be required. And that's what can happen. If these kinds of, rollbacks of the civil service protections and other employment standards of the U.S. government are allowed to proceed. And with or without that change, Trump is fighting climate change by firing the top scientist at NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Eric Noble, who had just been appointed the chief of staff there, was put in charge of removing Craig McLean, who is the chief scientist at NOAA. This is to make room for Ryan Mao, or Maui, a former researcher for the libertarian Cato Institute, who has criticized climate scientists for what he has called unnecessarily dire predictions. That's how we fight climate change. We silence the people, the scientists, who know something about it. And in the climate change file today is the wildfire in Orange County, Southern California. That's where Disneyland is, if you're not familiar with the geography. And Orange County is a sprawling county. But more than 100,000 residents have had to evacuate because of a pair of wildfires that popped up during the high-wind Santa Ana events over the past weekend that had my power shut down on Sunday night and into Monday. And that fire is only 5% contained as of this morning. Well, the carnage from COVID continues. We show 8.8 million cases in the United States, 74,000 reported yesterday, an increase over the past 14 days of almost 40%. We saw an additional 983 deaths reported yesterday, bringing the total attributed to COVID-19 to 226,700. And the top states affected right now by the current spikes remain North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Montana, and Wyoming. And a USA Today analysis of Johns Hopkins data through late yesterday shows that 20 states have set records for new cases in a week, while 3 states had a record number of deaths. That would be Nebraska, Tennessee, and Wyoming. The United States has reported more than 8.7 million cases, and the death tally that I just shared with you. For the first time since the pandemic began, we've added more than 500,000 cases in a single week. This is the third day in a row the U.S. set a record for how many cases it reported over the previous 7 days. And the U.S. has blown past our earlier records from July by almost 7%. And at the current pace, an American tests positive for COVID-19 every 1.2 seconds and dies from the disease in just under every 2 minutes. The White House Science Policy Office has listed ending COVID-19 pandemic, I mentioned that, among Trump's first-term accomplishments. This came from the Office of Science and Technology, saying that the decisive actions to engage scientists and health professionals in academia, industry, and government to understand, treat, and defeat the disease is the source of this raging success. Eli Lilly and Company, the pharma group in Indianapolis, announced it's reached an agreement with the U.S. government to supply 300,000 doses of its monoclonal antibody. And let me take a stab at their brand name for it, Bamlanivimab. Oh, can't you come up with something simpler than that? Bamlanivimab. Okay. The company agreed to provide the initial doses within 2 months of receiving an emergency use authorization from the Food and Drug Administration. They have applied. It has not yet been granted. Preliminary studies suggest that both Bamlanivimab and Regeneron's drug could be safe and effective at treating patients suffering from mild to moderate cases, but definitive studies have not yet been completed. And the feds stopped a trial of the Bamlanivimab, saying that early results suggested it was unlikely to prove effective against the disease. Lilly said it could manufacture up to 1 million doses by the end of this year. as it brings its capacity online. In Chicago, an ugly scene on Sunday. Two sisters walked into a shoe store. A security guard asked them to put on masks and to use some free hand sanitizer. And instead, these two sisters refused and brutally attacked the guard. The 18-year-old named Jayla Hill grabbed the man's hair while Jessica, age 21, stabbed him 27 times. What is it? What is it that infuriates people so much? And what gives them the sense of license to make an attack of this sort? I don't get it. And the stock market has COVID-19. The last 2 days have been extremely bloody. The Dow dropped a couple of hundred points yesterday. It was down 900 additional points in early trading today. And I don't know where it ended up at the closing bell. Italian police have deployed tear gas after demonstrators rallied across the country against nationwide coronavirus restrictions. That was Tuesday night. There were clashes in Rome's central Piazza del Popolo. Northern cities of Milan and Torino saw scenes of unrest from Monday into Tuesday. What's driving all this? Well, Europe is moving into a second wave lockdown. France has announced a 2-week lockdown. Germany is following suit. Britain is trying to avoid a total lockdown, asking people in hotspots to take extra restrictions. And the European Union is now trying to coordinate response as hospital capacity gets maxed out. They've already been airlifting patients from the Netherlands to Germany. Almost half of France's intensive care capacity has been taken up by new COVID cases. The president of the EU, her name is Ursula von der Leyen. We are deeply into the second wave, she said. Now more and more people are getting infected. More people will end up having to be hospitalized with the virus. Our expectations are that these figures will increase further over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and that they will increase rapidly. French President Macron gave a speech in prime time Wednesday evening in France and announced the new lockdown that will stay in place until the 1st of December. So that is a very significant step backward in France. And across the United States, El Paso, Texas is a extremely hard-hit area. They have started airlifting patients to hospitals as far away as San Antonio. They have set up a field hospital in a nearby parking lot near one of the hospitals, and they are really struggling to keep up with the demand. Fargo, North Dakota, the mayor has used his emergency powers to pass the first mask mandate in the state. This is in conflict with governors who say, no, we're not going to do that. We don't care what happens. In Twin Falls, Idaho, more than a third of the hospital patients at St. Luke's Magic Valley Medical Center have COVID-19, and they're sending other patients to hospitals in Boise, 2 hours away. The hospitals in Wisconsin are straining, where cases have increased 53% from 2 weeks ago. So it's really, at least in terms of cases, we're seeing huge increases. The hospitalizations are following. We keep our fingers crossed that the fatality rate will remain relatively low as compared with last spring in New York City. But it appears that we're truly struggling to control it. We have learned through a Britain-based organization called Air Wars that the U.S. was secretly very active in Yemen in 2017 and 2018, not so much in the last year and a half. But according to reports that were made to Congress by the Defense Department, there were no civilian casualty incidents in Yemen in 18 and 19. But according to this report from Air Wars, a majority of armed actions occurring in Yemen related to the United States took place in 2017. And the number of non-combatants is at least 20. So while that's not a huge number and doesn't suggest a massive deployment of U.S. forces there, we continue to support Saudi Arabia's brutal assault on Yemen by resupplying the Saudis. And a lot of that Trump has managed to tweet us into some form of obliviousness, I'd say. Mark Esper is currently the defense secretary in the Trump administration. He's not an acting defense secretary like so many other cabinet officers, but he is described as a dead man walking. And back in June, when he took that little stroll across Lafayette Square to St. John's Church with Trump, then Trump started talking about using the Insurrection Act to deploy American troops to the streets of American cities. Esper took exception to that, and he stated it publicly. And Trump wanted to fire him at the time, but decided that would be inconvenient to his election prospects. And Esper is getting ready to just waltz through the revolving door there and probably head back to Raytheon, where he'll make 8 or 10 times what he's been paid to buy Raytheon products as the Secretary of Defense. Alan McLeod has 2 great reports today at Mint Press News. I've linked to them and recommend that you read them. One relates to a New York Times article, and I actually missed this, which quoted Joe Biden's advisors saying that they would seek to revive the anti-corruption campaign that set off political earthquakes in Latin and South America starting in 2014. And that's really code for supporting the regime change operation which bounced the Workers' Party from control in Brazil. First, Lula da Silva, the president, was jailed. Then his successor, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached. That's all part of the car wash investigation. And to his everlasting credit, Glenn Greenwald exposed how the chief prosecutor, Sergio Moro, was corrupt. He was working for the people aligned with Bolsonaro who came to power as a result. And there was a little interference from the U.S. Under the Obama-Biden team, they bugged the phones of 29 top Brazilian officials, including Dilma Rousseff. And so, while the Times report presents Bolsonaro as an adversary of Biden, his rise was directly facilitated by the Obama administration's policies in Latin America. And while Biden appears to be falling, losing favor with Juan Guaido, who is the operative who wants to take out Maduro in Venezuela, we know that Biden supports a regime change in Caracas. McLeod's second report relates to the developing scene in Bolivia. And after the free elections that returned the party of Evo Morales to power, we see that the coup, the conservative people who are arrayed against the indigenous population, led by the temporary president, Janine Áñez, that they are struggling to rewrite the rules so that they're not the subject of some sort of a crackdown that leads the coup participants into jail terms in Bolivia. So I think it's an interesting piece. I encourage you to read it. And I do want to acknowledge that listener Barbara Watson sent me a correction because the other day I referred to Evo Morales as Hugo Morales when I was conflating Chavez and Morales. That's how my twisted little mind works sometimes. And finally today, the final step over at America's propaganda outlet to convert it from just American propaganda in general to pure Trump propaganda. The move has been made by Michael Pack, who is the CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media. They run Radio Free Europe, The Voice of America, Radio Marti, Radio Liberty, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, Radio Free Asia. And he has forcefully announced that he is removing the firewall that tried to protect the alleged journalists who were just supposed to produce broad American propaganda instead of that which explicitly focuses on Trump and his initiatives. So, I note this just because it is another firewall that's being taken down. Nobody in the corporate media says, hey, do we really need Radio Free Europe? Does it offer any useful role in the world today? No, we never asked that question. So this then becomes a partisan action by Michael Peck and a partisan reaction by the corporate media. Have a good day. Thanks for listening all the way to the end here of my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.